Then he goes on to say this. He says that their gospel is the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, right? And we know that Christ is the image of God, that they're propping up, not propping up in a negative way, but lifting up and showing Jesus. Because everything that Jesus did and said is who the Father is, who God is. Does that make sense? We're told that in John chapter 1, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? And then in chapter 1:1, and then in 1:14, we're told that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, right? Full of grace and truth. So we know that Jesus is the Logos, the Word, the expression of what God has to say. And again in Hebrews chapter 1, he tells us that even though God in past times spoke to our ancestors through prophets in these different ways, that he says in this last day, literally has spoken to us in the person of Son, okay? So, and that he is the express image, the exact image of the Father. So Paul's just saying when we preach Christ, we're preaching the Father. Why is that important? Because the Judaizers would come along and they want to change who God is. They want to change who Jesus is and what he did, all right? As we keep moving there, this gets interesting. Well, it's probably already interesting, but in verse 5 he says this. He says, "For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." Now, this is a little bit challenging because upon first reading, for me anyway, perhaps not you, there's two times. In verse 5, the word "for," and then in verse 6, he used the verse "for." He used the word "for." The thing is, these are two different words. Why do I bring that up? Because it can seem a little out of context. It can seem a little weird because he's just been saying like, hey, we're being authentic here. And the God of this age is trying to blind people from the authentic gospel and turn them to legalism or liberalism, sinful liberalism. And he says that those people are glad to take those lies, and I'm getting that from Romans chapter 1 and Romans chapter 2. And then he says, this is what we're talking about. It's Christ who's the image of God. And then it says, for we preach not ourselves. Why is that the follow-up? Why is the answer to that, we preach not ourselves? You're like, well, no, you just told us what you preach. It's not yourself. Why do you have this transitory word there? So the word "for" in verse 5 is actually the Greek word "gar," and it literally means a logical explanation. So it's more of it's a transition word that's saying because of what I said. It's kind of like therefore or because. So he says the reason that we preach not ourselves is because of verse 4. In other words, we don't promote ourselves, which is a common tactic of false teachers, right? A common theme amongst false teachers is the idea of, I'm important, you need to come to me for answers. Here's my book for 1995, right? It's full of revelation. I update it every year, right? You're like, that seems suspicious to me. But you know what I'm saying? It's normal for a false teacher to try to get us to need them, right? And we want to be careful with that. So with this little word "gar" in Greek, the point that he's making is that Christ and the gospel is so incredible, we don't preach ourselves. We don't have to talk about ourselves. We don't have to validate ourselves as if we're something, because we're not something. Jesus is something. And he goes on from there. He says, we don't preach ourselves because of this incredible gospel through Christ, who is the image of God. Instead, we preach Jesus Christ as Lord, right? That he is supreme kurios, supreme God of the universe, if you will. We preach Jesus Christ as Lord, and we preach ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. And the word there, servants, is doulos, which is a common word, right? It's a word that Paul uses in many of his letters to start it, that he calls himself a bondservant of Jesus Christ. And it's a reference back to the Hebrew, real briefly, since there's no social safety nets in the law, right? And there wasn't like WIC and these type of things for people that are in need, like we have today, which could be very helpful. Instead, you had laws that revolved around how you could be provided for if you were impoverished. Things like after somebody gathered their field, harvested their field, anything that was dropped, they had to leave behind, and you could go and harvest it off the ground for yourself. The fact that when you harvested your field, you couldn't harvest the corners. So the poor people were allowed to go and harvest the corners for themselves. Certain laws like that made it so that people could survive even when times were hard for them. Then there was also kind of the grand poobah option, if you will. When things were so bad, you could sell yourself into servanthood. And there were whole laws that were around that, right? They couldn't mistreat you. They couldn't take from you. They couldn't whip you. There's certain laws around how that worked. Well, actually, you could be corporal punishment, but if they damaged you, you got sent out and with money and everything to kind of start a new life. But the whole point is it was God's way of having a social safety net where you kept working, but it was in a way that you would sell yourself, and then that person was then responsible to provide for you and your family. So that could only last a maximum of 7 years, and that would be if you started it like right at the exact minute of the Jubilee, or not the Jubilee, but the Sabbath year. Anyway, all that to say is, if you got to the end of your servitude and you were like, this person is so kind to me, they provide so much for me, then what you could do is you could say, I want to be your bondservant. And they would grab you, and they would take you and they'd put your earlobe against the doorpost, which you're like, how did that work? That seems risky. And they would drive in all through your ear. I can't remember which side it was, but they drive in all through your ear, and they put a big gold ring, and you get this earring. And the whole implication is that when you're essentially working, whether it's on the farm or you're going into town for supplies, people would see that that earring, and it meant something. It showed that your commitment was that my master or the person I serve, they're so good, I never want to stop serving them. I'm going to serve them till I die. And it was a lifelong commitment. And so that's when Paul references doulos over and over and over again. He's a bondservant of Jesus Christ, right? And so here he uses the same word. He says, we don't preach ourselves. Jesus is so great, we don't need to preach ourselves. We're not trying to make ourselves better. We're not in this for ourselves. In fact, we just preach Christ as the Lord, and we preach ourselves as your bondservants. We're here to serve you, is what he says. This is very challenging, especially it seems like sometimes ministries kind of get away from people, and it starts to become about the minister instead of the people ministered to. And so we don't want to come to a place where it's all about us, do we? We want to be, when we're looking at our church, when we're looking at this world, we want to be bondservants to each other. That we say, I'm committed to serve these people, and I'm not giving up on them. That I want to continue to give them Christ. Now, this is a completely different mentality than the world gives us, right? Because the world is telling it, have it your way, right? If you go to Burger King or wherever. Just do it. Just do what you want to do, right? All of our slogans are all based on, how can I get mine? Give me a slogan that's attractive enough to my flesh that I will go out and buy your product, right? So, but Jesus says, unless you lose your life for my sake, right? He says, if you try to gain your life, you're going to lose it. And unless you lose it for my sake, that's the only way you'll gain it. So Paul is putting forward this idea, not that we continue to have, we just, whatever someone, I'm a bondservant and I'll just take whatever abuse comes my way. We're not saying that. But when we are abused by people around us in our church, or someone just wrongs us, I don't necessarily want to call it abuse if someone's just rude. That seems like it could get a little carried away. But if someone's rude or treats you poorly or borrows something and blows it up, or whatever it might be, that we come back and we say, hey, you know what? I don't appreciate that, but I love you. We can actually serve them if they've wronged us because we love them. And we can just point out, like, hey, you know what? When you said that I'm stupid, it kind of hurt my feelings. That might surprise you, but it did. So we have dialogue with people. And we can actually, when people wrong us, we can serve them, humble ourselves, and find reconciliation, right? Because the world says this, if you wrong me, when you come back to me, then we'll talk about it. Right? Isn't that what the world says? That's what we say. We'll leave the world out. Like we go to a church and we say, well, this isn't happening, that's not happening, so I'm done. Peace out. And then we go from church to church sometimes because we're just convinced that there's something that'll be better. And at the end of the day, we're just called to preach Christ, and him crucified and raised from the dead, forgiveness through his name, and to love him and love each other. And Paul's attitude was every person that he served, he's like, I'm a bondservant to you. I'm here to invest and see good things happen. It's a real key for ministry. That isn't to say you don't ever change churches. You absolutely change churches. I'm not saying that. But when you're at one, or when you're in your house, or when you're in your school, or when you're in your work, man, I'm here to serve these guys. I'm here to do whatever I can to make sure that they can see Jesus.